All right, here we go. Picking up where we left off last time, we were talking about gravity, so we won't go back and look at that again. But I think one of the key things to remember here, at least it seems to me, not everybody would agree with me, that the reason why the scientific revolution takes place in Europe and not somewhere else, takes place in the Western world, there might be a lot of reasons, but I think one of the reasons is that there was the idea that the universe, the world, was consistent. So that if I do something, that things are repeatable. And where does that idea come from? It comes from their view of God. The Judeo-Christian view of God is that God is consistent and God is a creator. So if God is a creator and consistent, then it would seem to make sense that God created something that was consistent. Okay? Anyway, that's the presupposition that somebody like Isaac Newton is working with, and this idea then that he can sort of discover the consistency of the universe is what he does. Now, some people are going to reject God, especially coming out of this period. They sort of keep the apparatus of an orderly universe. Many of them even keep the idea of a creator, but they abandon the sort of Judeo-Christian view and the Bible view, and they begin to see the universe like a machine. That machine has certain parts, that a machine functions in certain ways, and so that's the way they begin to look at it. Some of them even begin to call it the Newtonian world machine. Even though I'm saying Newton didn't divorce his ideas from God, he was not an atheist. He believed in God. He believed that God created everything. Some people are moving down that road where they are going to move perhaps into atheism. They're going to move perhaps into agnosticism. And they're going to take up a new kind of religion, we might call it, called deism. Deism. And I think we're going to talk about that. If not, remind me and I'll say something about it before we move on. So this begins to dominate the scientific mindset, and we start to see a process put into place whereby, is sometimes called the scientific method, whereby we can come up with ideas and conclusions. This is based upon observation. It's based upon coming up with a theory or a hypothesis, and then experimentation, and then a conclusion. The scientific method is put into place by Francis Bacon. And really, the second point I have here, Isaac Newton's view of the world and his view of physics dominates physics, science, at least until the time of until the time of Albert Einstein. But even now in the post-Einstein world, if you're working on real world kind of stuff, you're using Isaac Newton ideas. What do I mean? Well, if you drive your car down the road and you slam on your brakes, you can calculate your speed, you can calculate the coefficient of friction of your rubber on asphalt or whatever. And you're using all of that kind of laws of motion in everyday life. It's really when you start to get to subatomic particles, and as you're approaching the speed of light and all that kind of stuff, that the theoretical ideas of Einstein begin to, if you're using a neutron accelerator or something, that's a little different than if you're driving down the road. But still today, driving down the road, if you learn physics, you're going to learn a lot of those same principles in a physics class of friction and motion. Yeah? What? When? Well, it's actually after his time. So this would have been in like the mid-17th century this idea is developing in the 17th century. And really, you know, Francis Bacon is going to take the ideas in, say, 1600s and develop the scientific method. Now, this is built upon induction. The scientific method is built upon inductive reasoning. So I just try to explain here induction versus deduction, right? Maybe we should. I don't know, maybe you already know, but usually people have questions. So I thought, you know what, I'll just go ahead and give you that idea. Induction versus deduction. Induction, by the way, induction never gives you a 100% certain answer. Deduction does. Now, it doesn't mean it's right, but it can do that. And I'm not saying induction is better than deduction. I think both are useful, but we need to identify them. So let's just see if we can. What is deduction? Deduction was very much what somebody like Plato used in his philosophy. Deductive and deduction and deductive reasoning. From the particular to the general principle. What do I mean? All right, let's take something I think we can all agree upon. All professors are mean. You've heard of a syllogism? That's what this sort of is, right? Or a theorem. Let's say, for example, this is our observation. All professors are mean. Dr. Wineland is a professor. So, if 1 is true and 2 is true, then our conclusion must be true. That's deductive reasoning. Therefore, Dr. Wineland is mean. All right? Does that make sense? So that's deductive reasoning. And there's a place for it, but it's not the scientific method. All right. What is the induction? Induction is much more what Aristotle, you know, Aristotle was the student of Plato, but he didn't really follow Plato's teachings. You know, he went his own way. And he was very much more an observation, and that's what we're talking about. This would go from the general to the particular. The other was the particular to the general. This is general particular. Well, those terms make sense to you. So let's say if we're going to keep our same thing, which, you know, gets a little bit harder to do with this, we would have to somehow figure out a way of measuring professorial meanness. I don't know how we would do that. I guess you could do a survey, which always makes me nervous. You could survey the classes that I teach, or the classes that all the professors teach, right? But you would do me in particular, but you would look at 1,000 professors and you would somehow find a way to measure the meanness of professors, but then you'd also have to find a way to measure the meanness of normal people, non-professors. And then, if you did that, you could compare them, and if the meanness factor, or quotient, or whatever we want to call it, is consistently higher for professors than it is for regular people, then we could draw our conclusion that professors are meaner than normal people. Yes?
So induction is more fact-driven?
Well, I guess you could say it's fact-driven, yes, but part of the problem with it is how do you come up with those facts? How do you determine? For example, in this case, how would we actually measure meanness? If we could actually find a good way to do that, and for some things it'd be easier. Here's another example. If you want to know, how many teeth a horse has, well, you go out and you open up the mouth of a lot of horses and you count them. And then you take that number and you say, okay, I counted the teeth in 100 horses, and I came up with, I don't know what it is, something like 66. I don't know what it is. You can look it up. And but actually, some of them had 67, and some of them had a couple knocked out or whatever. So anyway, I would say, okay, it's 60 you know, in a 95 percentile, it's 66 teeth, let's say. So that means if I look at a horse out there, just a horse in general, I would say, well, there's a 95% chance that that horse has 66 teeth. Maybe that's a better example. I don't know. Maybe you don't like horses. Let's use alligators. No, let's not. Well, but what that tells me is that I can never be I'm not 100% sure. See, there's always a little, well, it's 95, it's 98. This is why some people who you might think, like you go in a court of law and they find the blood sample here and they find a blood sample there and it matches the guy and they say, well, it matches him to 98.9%. So is it an exact match? Well, 99%. But if you take that there are how many billions of people in the world, I don't know, what are there now? 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, I think. Anyway, out of that 1% of all the other people in the world, well, there might be 200 people that we might say could have done this. So are we sure this guy did it? Well, we're 99% sure. We're not 100% sure. Does that make sense? So science does not give us sort of absolute answers. That's the other thing you need to remember. Science gives us probability. The probability is high that this is this person's blood or that that horse has 66 teeth or whatever. I can't say with 100% certitude. But I'm usually going to be right if I've done my research right. Okay, so you're right. It is based upon facts. But you have to be careful how you've collected those facts and how you frame the way in which you're going to do that, especially if it's something that's not as easily quantifiable, like meanness, right? How do we measure that? I don't know. You just know it when you're around it, right? Okay. Well, we might be able to find a way. Well, that's induction and deduction. Now, Francis Bacon is going to take these ideas and he's going to move them forward. He, along with his friend Fred Egg, came up with a great breakfast that people still use today. It's called Francis Bacon and Fred Egg breakfast, or just bacon and eggs, for short. Now, that last part was not true. I'm just seeing if you're awake, and I can see some of you are not, because you're just still writing it down. That's all right. It's okay. You know, sometimes students ask me, you know, Dr. Wineland, sometimes I don't know when you're, you know, if it's something serious, if you really mean it or not. I say, yeah, that's right. Yes?
If we write that in our terms, do we get extra credit?
No, that's not. All right, anyway, let's move on. You guys distract me from my mission to get through this PowerPoint. So he's going to he's going to use scientific experiments. Now, here's one of the things about science. One of the principles of science is that you ought to be able to repeat it. You see? If I take these chemicals here in beautiful Lakeland, Florida, and I mix them together, and I get a reaction, so I write down what I did, I measure what I did, all my observations. This is why in science labs you keep notebooks, and you keep your observations and all that kind of stuff that sometimes people don't want to do. If something happens there, I should be able to do that same experiment, the same chemicals put together in Detroit or Seattle or London or wherever I am, and I should get the same answer. I mean, the same thing should happen. It should be repeatable. If it's not repeatable, then other scientists will say, well, you know what? You know, you say that happened, and we followed what you told us you did, and it didn't happen that way for us. So therefore, we question what you're doing. So in other words, science observations should be repeatable. It's part of the problem. Sometimes things in life are not repeatable, so they don't quite fit into science very well. All right? Anyway, so he will say, you know what you need to do? You need to be systematic. You need to do experiments. You need to take the notes. It needs to be repeatable. And then the idea of scientific societies are started, especially in places like England and France. They will start elsewhere too. But basically, this is just a place where scientists can come and have a meeting. And kind of like what we're doing here, one of them would stand up and say, okay, this is what I did, and this is how I did it, and this is what I found. And then other people in a room would say, well, you know, I did something similar to that, and this is what I found. Or somebody said, have you ever thought about trying this or this? And then you discuss it, you see. And then the idea is you've shared your ideas with others, because the idea here is that we build upon each other's knowledge and work. People of the past and current, we get input. Well, I do, you know, I work in archaeology, so it's not a pure science. But you know, most academics go to conferences. That's what they do today. And you go to the conference, you present your findings and what you did, and then you get feedback from those who are listening. Somebody says, well, you know, you found that, but have you ever found this? We found this over here. How does that compare to what you have? And so on. And so this gets a dialogue going. That's how learning will take place, right? Dialogue. That's why I always lecture and don't let you talk, because dialogue is the way people learn. What? Wait a minute. Well, anyway, yeah, you can ask questions, of course. I try to answer them as best I can. I tend to lecture. You know, some people, I don't know. That's not in vogue today, but that's, I don't know. I don't know how to do it any other way, I guess. I try to ask the questions, but then when I ask the questions, like nobody says anything, and then I just think, you know, it's kind of wasting everybody's time. We should just move on. But maybe that's just me. This is more about me than you. But anyway, let's move on, since I don't know what else to say about this. Well, let's talk about a guy by the name of Descartes. René Descartes, not René Descartes. Although that's the way it's spelled, that's not the way the French guys would say it. My French is not that good, but René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Now, he was greatly influenced by all these things of the scientific revolution, this idea that Copernicus said that, you know what, we're looking at the universe wrong, the Earth's not in the center, the sun's in the center. Descartes was a mathematician, but he begins to think about this, you know, how do I actually know what it is I know? Now, if it leads you down the path, especially before lunch, this is gonna be tough for you, especially when you get over there and where they're serving lunch and you don't know, you know, they say this is chicken. How do you know it's chicken? Well, it's got a sign on there. It's chicken and rice or whatever, chicken something, chicken surprise. Okay. Or you come to my house and you get barbecue chicken pizza, which is good. Well, anyway, he begins to doubt everything. He doubts everything. He even doubts that he exists. So if you start to get to that point, I'd say go over and, you know, go to the salad bar and have some lettuce or something until you recover. But he did. He even got to the point, what he said was, that he was staring at his hand like this. I see some of you staring at your hand right now. He was staring at his hand like this, and he said, how do I know that this is me, that I'm here? In other words, maybe I'm not here. Maybe I'm a part of some evil genius's toy house, right? Or play, you know, toy universe, and I'm just, you know, an imaginary thing. I'm just there's some real powerful creature that is having a dream, and I'm in that dream, and I think I'm in that dream, and I think I'm real, but I'm not really real. Whew. Well, anyway, that's the kind of stuff he was thinking about. So he comes up with this principle, which he writes in Latin, de omnibus dubitantem. Everything is to be doubted, or doubt everything. even his own existence. Most people think they exist. Maybe not everybody in this room, but that's probably most of you think you're actually here, wherever this is. Maybe you're not here. Maybe I'm dreaming, and I'm just dreaming I'm teaching this class. If that's the case, I want to wake up from this nightmare. No, just kidding. So, now, because, he was a mathematician, so you might say, well, at least, Renee, don't you believe 1 + 1 is 2? You got 1, and another 1, you got 2. And he says, well, I would normally agree with you, but what if this evil genius has just been playing games with me, making me think that all this stuff makes sense? Right? See? He's got me. Yeah. He's in the Matrix. He knows what I'm talking about. So, see? So that's what he goes to, and then what he has to do then is he has to rebuild all of this. He rebuilds all of this in his writing Discourse on Method in 1637, and he finally comes up with this saying which has become famous: cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. You see, if I'm imaginary, why would I think about myself being imaginary and doubting my own existence? That wouldn't make any sense, right? Because I wouldn't even have that desire, that ability. There's no reason. At least this is what he convinced himself. Maybe you're not convinced of what he was convinced of, but he believed that since he could actually think about whether he was real or not, he must be real. It's kind of like I hear people saying, I don't know if it's true or not, that if you actually think you're crazy, you're not. Because if you were crazy, you would just think you were normal. So that makes me wonder, if you think you're normal, maybe you're really crazy. Well, anyway, that's for a whole different department. I plead departmental immunity on those kinds of psychological questions. Yes?
But if you believe you're confident and you come off as confident, that's also something. So you think you're confident, or you are.
Being confident, if you believe you're confident, then you are confident? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that works. Well, maybe. Maybe it works. I don't know. I think people see through it if people are faking it. But you know what they say? Fake it
Till you make it.
till you make it. And again, that's completely out of my department. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's what people say. I do know people say that. I don't know if it's true. I've certainly done it a lot. I'm doing it right now. No, just kidding. Cognito ergo sum. Now, Descartes, you can blame him for a lot of stuff if you're in the blame game, and most of us are. He comes up with this idea, what's called Cartesian dualism. What is Cartesian dualism? Sounds wild, doesn't it? But his name is Descartes. That's where we get Cartesian. All right? Dualism just means two. What he's talking about is the physical body and the mind. All right? And the interaction between the mind and the body. Yeah.
Mind over matter?
It's not really, I don't think it's mind over matter, but what he's saying is that I have a mind, at least most people do, unless you've lost it. But you have a mind, and his idea is that the mind is not just your brain. That your mind is something separate from your body. But that your mind probably resides in your brain, or at least that's sort of where it interacts with you, and it kind of, he even had this idea that you kind of move your body around with the mind, kind of like a pilot of a boat. The pilot's in the boat. The pilot is not the boat, but the pilot is controlling the boat. Does that make any sense? So his idea is that the mind would be the pilot of the boat, or the guy driving the boat, right? They don't say drive it. They don't like it. People with boats don't like you to say they're driving it. They're sailing it, whatever they're doing. And the boat, they're inside there, but the boat, they're separate. But that the will of the mind controls the body. Well, we're getting kind of philosophical this afternoon. But that's all right. Sometimes we got to think about these things. So that's why, even though he's a mathematician, he's sometimes called the father, he used to be, the father of modern philosophy. Where he's saying that the mind is separate from the body and controls it. And therefore, he starts to view things that way. So he would identify himself with his mind, but he doesn't necessarily identify his mind with his body. His body is something different than his mind. Well, you know, this is going to happen. You know, someday they're going to transfer all your stuff over to a hard drive somewhere, and then you're just going to be out there in cyberspace, you know, canoeing or whatever you do, and kayaking, just virtually. And then until they transfer you into another guy's body or something, or a robot. See? Skynet, baby. It all comes back to Skynet. And then they're going to put you in a robot, and then you're going to rule the world. Well, whatever. I know. That's why I'm on their side. Anyway. It's going to keep saying that, especially when they come through the door. Hey, I'm on your side. All right, so there you go. Descartes, he comes up with analytical geometry. He comes up with... Have you ever, in math class, have you ever had a math class? I assume you have, right? Have you ever used a Cartesian graph? You know what I'm talking about? X and Y?
Oh, yeah.
And Z sometimes?
Yeah.
If you used an XY graph, you can blame this guy, because he's the one that comes up with the X and Y coordinates. Sometimes add Z to it. That's him. That's why it's called a Cartesian graph. It's named after Descartes. Well, there's a lot more stuff we could blame on him or talk to him about. So here's this thing that I keep coming back to. And as we're approaching the end of this topic, I just want to come back to this idea again. The scientific revolution is based upon the idea that the universe, the world that we live in, is consistent. That is, if I jump out of that window every day, I'm going to fall every day, right? If I drop something, it's going to fall every time. That wasn't always the case. That the Greeks and the Romans didn't always believe that the world was consistent. Why? Because their gods were not consistent. Their gods were capricious. Their gods were sometimes in a bad new mood, and they might just want to mess up somebody's day. So yesterday maybe you did these 5 things and everything went well, but today you do the same 5 things and it doesn't go well. Why? They're messing with you. They're looking down, say, hey, see that guy? I'm going to give him a hard time today. Why? Because I'm in a bad mood. So he thinks he's going to do the same thing he did yesterday. He's going to walk through that door, he's going to do this, do that, and that's all going to happen. But no, it's not. I'm going to play with him. I'm going to mess with you. Watch. And so they tell their other god friends, look what I'm doing to this guy. See? Because their gods were sort of like humans, except much more powerful. And humans, of course, as you know, are vengeful. They don't always make sense. They do things just out of spite and other things like that. That's the way the Greco-Roman gods and most of these pagan gods were. But the God of the Bible is very consistent, always the same. Every day, today, tomorrow, forever, going to be the same. No matter what I do, you know, while you were my enemy, I still loved you. Why? Well, that's the way he is. That's not going to change tomorrow. I'd say, well, you know what? I'm going to get you back now because you did bad stuff and you're going to get it. And so this is the idea that God is consistent and that God is the creator and that God is good. So if God is good and God is consistent and God is a creator, then his creation should be good and consistent. That's the sort of deductive reasoning, right? So, and one thing for sure, when we begin to separate God out of people's lives, at least in my opinion, it's going to lead people down a road of skepticism, of despair, of doubt, things like suicide and other destructive behavior. And you see some of these people that, you know, they're famous, they're rich, they got all this stuff, and yet, you know, They take their lives. Why? They got everything that everybody would say you would want. They got fame, they got money, they got possessions, they got, whatever, but still it's not enough, right? So we have to ask ourselves why. Well, this is not a religion class, but I think there's more to it than just the physical, right? Well, anyway, let's talk about deism. Some of the people are not willing to go as far as atheism. They still like the idea of God sort of being out there and creating things. But they don't really sort of like the idea that God intrudes in your life. I would submit to you today that there are a lot of people today who are actually functioning deists even if they don't even know what the word is. A lot of people I've met anyway. They kind of believe God's out there, he's up in the sky. He's the big guy in the sky, and he's made things, and in the end he's going to judge you. But right now he doesn't really care what's going on. Therefore I don't really pray and don't look for God to intercede. I'm kind of on my own. But in the end, if I don't follow his rules, I'm going to be in trouble. That's deism. I mean, kind of a simplified form of it, but that's what it is. God is removed from the present world. He's uninvolved in our matters right now. He's like a clockmaker, he was described by some of the people at this time. They tell a story about a guy walking along in the woods, and out of the corner of his eye he sees a little glint, and he looks down near the base of a tree and he sees this shiny gold watch. Of course, this is back when they had like pocket watches. You know what I'm talking about? You put them in your pocket, little round thing, you open them up and it's ticking. And I don't know if you ever looked at one of those, but you can screw the back off of those and you can see all the gears in there and the springs and all that. So the guy does that and he goes, wow. He goes, look what I found, this gold watch. Look at how intricate all the little gears are and the springs and all that. So I assume there is a clockmaker who made this clock and made it very precise. This is the way they begin to look at the universe. God made the universe very precisely. He wound it up like a clock. He sets it down in the universe and he leaves it alone. And someday the clock's going to stop. And then God's going to come and see what people did. And he's going to judge them. That's a view a lot of people have. God is not involved in our world today, but he's kind of there. He made things and he's sort of going to, people, in the end those mean people are going to get it. Right? Why? Because God's going to give it to them. And we kind of like that idea, but that was their view. That's deism. Now, eventually they'll decide to just get rid of the idea of God, and they'll just say, well, there's just the world, just a universe out there, and it's just a machine, and they kind of remove God from the picture. But deism then becomes a popular view.
But deism believes in God, right?
Pardon?
Deism believes in God.
Deism believes in God as a creator and as a judge in the end. But they don't believe that God is involved in our world today. On day-to-day basis. Well, here's a famous deist for you. You may not know as a deist. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. You can go to his house and you can see the Jeffersonian Bible, it's called, and Thomas Jefferson took the Bible and he took a penknife, kind of like an X-Acto knife, took a little knife and he cut out all the miracles. He literally, in the page, he just cut that part out. He thought Jesus was a great teacher. He thought God existed. He thought there were sort of rules we ought to live by, and that God created everything, He'd judge everything, but God is not active. God would never do miracles. God would never get involved. There's no real reason to pray because God's not going to answer those prayers. Now, some people today would say, yeah, go ahead and pray because psychologically it makes you feel better. Not that they believe God's going to do anything, but I guess, if you sort of believe that, then that's going to help you feel better about things. So go ahead and pray. But they don't think it's effective. They don't think it changes anything. Well, A lot of this deism becomes popular then during the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment is centered in Paris. Why in Paris? Well, France is really a very rich country during the 1600s. Got a lot of money. And you know what? If you're going to sit around and talk about this kind of stuff, like staring at my hand and seeing if it exists, you're not going to do that unless you got some time to kill. You know what I'm saying? If you're worried about where you're eating lunch, if you're worried about taking care of your kids, you're probably not sitting around wondering if you exist. See what I'm saying? So you need to have a society where people have enough money and free time to have the kind of interest in these sorts of things like philosophy and everything, to have time to think about that and to read these things and to write these things and still know you're going to be able to eat lunch and dinner and have a place to sleep. So France having enough money means that people could do this. The good economy is going to support the idea of having a guy like a philosopher who sits down and writes this kind of stuff, who doesn't do what we might call productive work, right? Not producing any food. I've had people in my family want to know, when am I going to get a real job? You know, where you actually do something. You know, like, what do you do? I said, well, I just kind of talk to people. I just talk to people. Don't you make anything? Don't you sell anything? Don't you what? You just talk about stuff, see? That doesn't seem very productive to some people I know. Well, I said, well, you know, as long as they keep paying me, I guess I'll do it. But it doesn't fit the idea. See, most of everybody, I came from my background and my family is like, you got to work hard if you're going to be able to eat and have a place to sleep. And sitting around talking about a bunch of dead people doesn't seem very productive. Now, I think it is, but anyway. Well, you got to have the time to do it. Now, these intellectuals would write stuff down. They would put it in pamphlets and books, and in fact, people would have parties, soirees, in their home. In your home today, we don't really have this in your home today. Have you ever heard of a parlor? People don't have parlors anymore. I never hear anybody say, hey, well, let's go to the parlor. And do you know where the word parlor comes from? Parlor, the word parlor. Anybody here study French? You know what they do in the parlor? They talk. What's the French word for talk? Parler. So the parlor is for parlaying. Well, you wouldn't say parlaying, but you parlay in the parlor. Because that's what people used to do. I know it sounds kind of boring. They would sit around and talk. I mean, well, who does that? I mean, where's the video games? Where's the big screen TV? Where's the smartphone? I mean, now if you go to somebody's house, most of the time you don't talk. You just all come over and sit on the couch and watch whatever it is that's going on the big screen, and maybe at a commercial or something you say, hey, you want some chips? And that's it. There's not much talking going on. Maybe you're yelling at the team or whatever, that's terrible, But there's not a lot of like this, dialogue going on, you know what I'm saying? That's what people used to do. They didn't have televisions, video games, smartphone. What did they do? Well, they actually talked to one another. And so people would have parties, soirees, and they would actually invite these philosopher guys to their house. And if you could get like the hottest guy, the latest guy with his idea, you could say, well, if you come to my house, say, all I got's pizza. But if I said, hey, we're going to have, some well-known person is going to be there at my house, and they're going to be talking about this well-known stuff that you really want to hear about, you say, well, I'm going to show up to that place because I want to hear that guy. See? I want to get the latest news. I want to get the latest ideas. And so that is how this developed amongst a certain circle. Obviously, people that had some money who could have these parties and could invite these people, and they would gather in the parlors to hear the latest ideas. This is what begins the enlightenment. Now, this happened in people's houses. It also happened in what we might call intellectual clubs or salons. Not saloons, salons. I'm not talking about getting your hair done. We're talking about this is a place where you would go and have, well, you see these guys sitting here. They're in the salon. They're kind of sitting around, maybe having something to drink, maybe a little something to eat, and they're mainly just talking, sitting around a table. And these philosophers, who are sort of motivational philosophers, these philosophes, would come and write pamphlets and sometimes visit these salons or these houses, these parties, and that's how they would sell their pamphlets, but it's also how they got their name out there. Yeah?
Is that why they call it like hair salons? Can you just go there and get your hair done and talk?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah, probably. You just sit around and... See, I try not to go in those places, so I don't really know what happens. I know women, mostly women, although now guys are going in there. They go in there and then they come out like an hour or two later and you have to say, oh, that's nice. See, basically that's what, oh, very nice. Have you done something to your hair? See, that's a very dangerous question because you want to know. What do you mean, have I done something with my hair? Okay. You're not paying any attention. So sometimes it's just best to just kind of go, nice. Stuff like that. And that way you don't actually reveal that you don't really know what's changed. That's just my word of advice. You just kind of smile and nod your head. That's sometimes safer than actually saying something. Okay. That's enough of the advice. I'm not that good for advice giving, but there's one little piece that might help you. Well, anyway, who are these philosophers? You might think they're sort of like a philosopher, but you know what? Philosophers are happy enough to sit around in their office and read books and maybe write stuff. And, you know, if they didn't have to come out to teach classes, they would probably just stay there, right? They're not necessarily wanting to change the world, but a philosopher is a motivational philosopher. A philosopher wants to change your way of thinking because they think their way of thinking about it is the right way, and if you do that and everybody does that, the world will be a better place and so forth. So that is the philosophers. All right, so we'll end this one here.